Welcome back. I want to quickly finish off chapter 4 and then get you into chapter 5 because there's a lot of good stuff in chapter 5 and it's going to take more than one episode. Anyway, after her quick explanation of how the abomination known as corporate personhood came about as a result of the Santa Clara case, Catherine goes into how corporate persons started playing states against one another for more favorable tax treatment. She points out that this created a national race to the bottom between states eager to get corporations to build headquarters or factories in their states. It's called a race to the bottom because it pretty much bankrupts states when they can't charge reasonable taxes because corporate persons can just move to a different state with lower taxes that the states offer because they're so desperate for the jobs. Catherine only just mentions that this is now happening on a global scale. Because this global race to the bottom is such an abomination, I wanted to take a minute to introduce you to another pseudo-intellectual nerd named Friedman. If you recall in vid 10, Catherine and I introduced you to Milton Friedman. Now I'd like to introduce you to another completely unrelated Friedman named Thomas, who published this book in 2005. Although this guy has no apparent understanding of economics at all, much less true Adam Smith-style capitalism, this book was so helpful to global corporatist elites that they essentially elevated him to minor elite status himself. Even invited him to appear at their annual self-congratulatory circle jerk, their annual economic summit at Davos, Switzerland, where he was photographed with another elite who has been even more useful to the global corporatists. Once again, I want to mention that pseudo-intellectual nerds like this guy are not generally bad people, the way that sophist nerds are. They're just smart, straight-A student types without a whole lot in the way of common sense, whose beliefs, ideas, and opinions are helpful to rich elitist a-holes. Getting back to Catherine's book, next she talks about how the newly spawned from hell corporate persons use legal manipulations to create huge trusts, essentially giant clusters of corporations that served as monopolies. Maybe you remember something about the Sherman Antitrust Act from school? Well, we were never taught about how wimpy enforcement of it was thanks to corporate influence over politicians. Catherine says that by 1933, 0.1% of the nation's corporations owned 52% of all corporate assets. To put that into perspective, a dime is 0.1% of $100. And in 1935, this percent owned over half of all corporate assets in America. So much for what is supposed to be capitalism in what is supposed to be a democracy, creating opportunities for all. Catherine adds that a lot of those corporations were already multinationals and had operations overseas, including in Nazi Germany, where they contributed to Hitler's war effort. She does not mention that one particular petroleum company that had developed a special process for manufacturing high-octane fuel for fighter planes was operating in Nazi Germany, making fuel for Hitler's fighters that were shooting down our American B-17 bombers, each of which had a crew of 10 men, very few of whom were able to bail out before their planes crashed. Hitler's Luftwaffe, his Air Force, shot down over 5,000 B-17s over Europe. You do the math. Catherine also doesn't mention that several big American companies with assets in Nazi Germany had those assets damaged by our bombs during the war. Before you go breaking out the world's tiniest violin, after the war, those corporations sued our government for the damage to their factories during the war and won. We the people paid for damage to American corporatists' factories that were helping the Nazis in their war effort. In 1950, just 5 years after World War II ended, the 250 biggest manufacturing corporations in America had productive capacity equal to the entire country before the war. And they got that big and rich, not through the wonders of capitalism, but through the wonders of massive government spending. Catherine mentions that President Dwight Eisenhower was elected in 1952 and saw the national security implications of corporate influence on government and democracy. She doesn't mention, but President Eisenhower did try to do something about it, but because Congress had been so completely bought and paid for by corporations, he wasn't able to achieve much. She does mention that in his farewell address in January 1961, he did mention the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power. Historians note that in his original draft of that speech, he mentions the military-industrial complex. Staffers convinced him that it would be unwise to use that phrase, but it's a clear indication that he understood the incestuous relationship that existed between business and government. Catherine kind of sums it up toward the end of the chapter saying, "The myth that corporations are somehow equivalent to the human beings Adam Smith was liberating in his free market system represents possibly the most successful political coup in the history of the world." She then goes on to blame both parties and ends off saying, both parties have been complicit, trading tax favors for fat campaign contributions. Then she asks, what role do we play in our so-called capitalist system? Well, she's going to answer that in her next chapter, entitled Valuing Human Capital. Catherine begins chapter 5 saying that today our nation's economic health depends more upon increased consumption than on the production of goods and services. Other nerds would point out that this is totally bass-backward, and a nation absolutely must produce more than it consumes, or its infrastructure would go to hell. In fact, it was the building of infrastructure many thousands of years ago that led to civilization itself. In the mid-20th century, it was massive infrastructure spending, mainly on the military, that led to the high-tech computer and telecommunications revolutions, so that tech billionaires could get filthy rich and then sit up on their high horses and say, look at what I achieved, and I did it all by myself, so I don't owe anybody anything. Catherine points out that thanks to this bass-backward economic system, wages for most workers have stagnated or fallen over the last 35 years, and good jobs are disappearing. She wrote this 10 years ago, so make that closer to 45 years now. Well, rather than examine the decline in jobs and wages, our political and corporate leaders only bothered to figure out how to solve the problem of declining revenues, declining income, for themselves. The solution was to extend more and more credit to consumers. Catherine says, perversely, consumer debt is now a valuable commodity to be packaged and sold by New York investment banks that magically take consumer debt and package it into what are called investment products that rich people can buy and sell and gamble on. Next, she goes into how this screwed up economic system came about. In a quick nutshell, by the late 1800s robber baron era, corporations had for all intents and purposes taken over our government. We the people were on our own. But after becoming president, Teddy Roosevelt who was, by the way, a strong supporter of both true American capitalism and democracy, he started busting up monopolies and going after corporate corruption. Catherine says he even called for a ban on corporate money in politics.
Good luck with that. Let me know how it works out.
Old Teddy quickly realized he had two big old problems. The first was corporate persons that obviously didn't want to give up any of their power. The other problem was with rich elites who denounced both the excessive power of the corporations as well as the power of the government to control them. Catherine says that should sound familiar. After the economic train wreck of 2008, the Tea Party movement, funded, so you know, by rich corporatists, targeted both the Wall Street investment banks as well as so-called big government and all of its pesky regulations as the things that were destroying our economy. Catherine makes the crucially important point that by attacking government regulation, corporatists were attacking what Adam Smith had clearly identified as the only thing that could keep corporations and their corruption of both our economy and our government in check. Teddy Roosevelt knew this and started working toward establishing a federal income tax which originally mostly taxed the rich, who, I would add, get rich by taking advantage of our nation's resources, infrastructure, and civil institutions, which weren't theirs to begin with. Teddy and his successor, William Howard Taft, also started working toward establishing the Federal Reserve System, the Fed, which, so you know, was originally intended to provide a stable economy for we the people by curbing rich people's speculation, essentially gambling, which always leads to market bubbles and disastrous crashes. But, as Catherine points out, Woodrow Wilson was president when the Fed was actually established, and somehow it became an institution pretty much of New York banksters, by New York banksters, for New York banksters.
Surprise, surprise, surprise!
It's actually no surprise at all that the big New York investment banks and the Fed operate with little oversight, little transparency, and virtually no accountability. But oh my God, how the banks complain about regulations. Except when it comes to small investors punking billionaire hedge funds. Woodrow Wilson left office in January of 1921 during a recession. To solve the recession problem, his successor, Warren Harding, instituted the easy credit policy that Catherine talked about earlier. She says, what happened in 1921 is exactly what occurred in 2001 with the same outcome. What happened both times was that the Fed, the Federal Reserve System, lowered interest rates and essentially threw any requirement for banksters to behave responsibly, even sanely, right out the window. The reckless investment bubble took 8 years to burst in 1929. It only took 7 years for it to burst in 2008. Apparently banksters got better at crashing our economy over time. Yay banksters! Or not. That's about it for today. In my next episode I'll continue with Chapter 5, where Catherine talks about how reforms created the greatest economic boom in the history of the world, and how that eventually went away, leaving us with the situation we got now. Hope you join me. If you like this video, why not click the like button? I'll put a link to the next episode over here.